Welcome to the Student Success Podcast. I'm Al Solano, founder of the Continuous Learning Institute, or CLI, a higher education online resource focused on providing community college and open access university educators with practical information on how to get results at their campus. As a resource within CLI, the Student Success Podcast is focused on just that, the challenges, opportunities, failures, and successes of practices intended to improve student success and equity. The goal is to leave you with thought-provoking ideas, nuts and bolts information, and or lessons learned from the field so you can consider how you might apply them to your institutional context. For today's podcast, it's a privilege to have Dr. Frank Harris III, Professor of Post-Secondary Education and Co-Director of the Community College Equity Assessment Lab at San Diego State University. Dr. Harris is best known for his expertise in racial equity in post-secondary education and has made important contributions to knowledge about college student development and the social construction of gender and race in college contexts. His work prioritizes populations that have been historically underrepresented and underserved in education. He is the co-editor and author of 4 books. His commentary has been featured in diverse issues in higher education, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Chronicle of Higher Education, the Huffington Post, Inside Higher Ed, and CNN. Before joining the faculty at San Diego State, Dr. Harris worked as a student affairs educator and college administrator in areas of student crisis support and advocacy, new student orientation programs, multicultural student affairs, academic advising, and enrollment services. Thank you for participating in the Student Success Podcast, Frank.
Thank you, Al. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I like to start all the podcasts, ask about if you happen to have a hobby or a talent, something beyond your meaningful work that you wouldn't mind sharing.
Yeah, so I'm not very talented, beyond my work, which I know we'll kind of delve into during this conversation. But in terms of hobbies and how I like to spend my free time, I like to exercise. So more so for my mental health than my physical health, believe it or not. So I've recently taken up boxing. I'm not fighting another person. It's just hitting mitts and bags, but I really enjoy that. Feel like I get a good workout with that, and it's kind of something new that I've recently started to do. And then, I have 5 kids. My partner and I, we like to vacation. We like to do the normal stuff that families do. So take trips and, do things with our kids as much as they'll allow us to do things with them. Yeah, so I would say outside of my work, my life is pretty normal, whatever that means, right?
Boxing, when did you start working on the boxing activity?
About a month ago. So, I think what happened with COVID, if you're like me, you recognize that your pre-COVID workout routine doesn't really serve you as well during COVID for a lot of different reasons. I felt like I needed to do something to just kind of switch it up, to be able to get more cardio in. And so I hate cardio. So I'm not going to go running. I'm not going to ride a treadmill for an hour or so. I needed something that was a little bit more active. And so boxing seemed like a good thing to do. A good friend and colleague of mine who we both know, Luke Wood, had been doing some boxing for about 4 months, and he's gotten some amazing results. And so I decided to kind of join into his boxing training routine. It's been very beneficial. I've enjoyed it.
Really appreciate about boxing is that so much of it is about mental agility, the ability to coordinate your hands and your torso and your hip and being able to even hit the mitts with certain counts, right? It takes a lot of mental agility.
It's interesting you say that, Al, because I struggle. I find that boxing has really challenged me like no other routine or workout, like nothing else, to be honest with you. So, I find myself, obviously I'm a beginner. I haven't been doing it for a long time, but I really struggle. I struggle mentally. It really stretches me. So being able to remember the combinations and being able to know that, 1 is a jab and 3 is a hook, and putting it all together and doing it as your body continues to get more and more exhausted, right? The more physically tired you are, the more mentally challenging it is. And so I find that, obviously I went there just for thinking it was going to be a good, physical exercise, but it's really taxed me and it's really challenged me mentally to the point where I get frustrated sometimes. And, talking to the trainer and, every now and then he'll say, okay, well, Frank, you're not getting these combinations. So I want you to go over there by yourself and go hit the bag for, 5 minutes. It's like kind of being put in punishment in some ways. It's been good. I really like it.
Oh, you get good at it with time. So talking about stretching mentally, I think we're going to do that with today's podcast because you are a tremendous expert in equity, but we're going to drill down further to racial equity and even further and stretch people's minds around anti-Blackness. So if you can, please unpack first what that is before we get into addressing it. So love to learn from you about this.
Yeah, great. Let's start with equity. So, one of my mentors, and someone who I just have tremendous respect for, Dr. Stella Bensimon. I often say that everything that I learned about equity, I learned from her. And so when she talks about equity, she talks about disproportionate impact, recognizing that, somebody is not benefiting as much from this experience, or someone or some group is not being well served by a system, by an institution, whatever it may be, as a starting point. And then from there, that brings you to equity mindedness. And I describe equity mindedness as the ways in which we as educators bring life and action to our equity work. It's how we really actualize and realize the goals of our equity work. And so, when you're equity minded, it's really about a mindset. It's really about how you approach your work, the responsibility you assume for addressing and eradicating disproportionate impact. It's thinking about the folks who you are serving differently, whether those be students or other educators. It's not enough to just understand and know what equity is. It's not enough to just understand that we're trying to address disproportionate impact. It's also about changing our minds, because when we change our mindsets, then, the actions and the way that the things that we do, regardless of what we do our work differently when we approach it from an equity-minded perspective. And then when you talk about racial equity has always been a pressing issue for us educators. The events of the last 18 months have really helped us understand, if we didn't already, has made it more transparent as to why we have to be more focused on racial equity. And so we're looking at racial equity, we're looking at groups who are disproportionately impacted on the basis of their racial identity. In most places, it's African American, it's Latinx, it's Southeast Asian, Pacific Islander, it's Native Americans, right? So it's groups who've been historically marginalized, groups who've been the most adversely impacted by white colonization. And in a lot of ways, when we talk about racial equity, we really are, deconstructing and examining a group's relationship or relative position with white supremacy. And then when we talk about anti-Blackness, I would say it's certainly related to racial equity, but it's a deeper and in some ways a more intense issue. I like to, not the way that I describe anti-Blackness is having a very deep disdain for Black culture, Black people, and being opposed to any type of Black social political progress, anything that liberates and anything that improves the living conditions of Black people, Black communities. And I use the word Black intentionally because I'm talking about the entire diaspora. So, not saying African Americans, because African Americans is obviously a very significant subculture of the larger Black community, but I'm talking about the entire African diaspora. That's what I would offer as a starting point in terms of how I try to make sense of those three very different but very related concepts. And it's about not only understanding it, but also how do we operationalize those things is where the real work is.
We see so much of this disdain for equity, racial equity, and then the anti-Blackness. We see it in social media. We see it in the news. It's front and center. Because you work within the context of higher ed, how have you seen it at institutions of higher education?
Anti-Blackness in particular?
Sure, if you want to go down the line of the three or you want to focus on the third, it's up to you.
Well, let's start with equity. First, it's important to understand that equity, and again, this is not me. This is Estella Bensimon speaking. I'm sort of channeling her work, through myself. Equity is not just an issue that we have in education, in higher education. Inequity is a chronic issue, whether we're talking about post-secondary education, K-12 education, our healthcare system, our justice system, the workforce, every social system that impacts the lives of communities, the lives of disproportionately impacted families and communities. There's inequity that is ingrained within it. So it's not just an education issue to start. So we have to have this systemic perspective in recognizing and understanding it. Now, where we see it, play out in, let's talk about post-secondary education and community colleges. There's some very clear indicators, right? We look at, time to completion. We can look and see that there are certain groups whose time to completion are much longer, much more extended, much more difficult and challenging than it is for other groups. And in many ways, it's the groups that we started the conversation with, which, it's our racially minoritized populations. It's our, adult learners in many respects, although adult learners comprise, the majority of students in community colleges, so we should recognize that. But then you look at some other populations. You look at former foster youth. You can look at, students with disabilities and so forth. And so we see disparate outcomes when we disaggregate success data on almost every indicator of success, completion, course success, whatever it may be, right? We see inequities very clearly manifested. But the quantitative data only tell you one piece of the pie, right? It only tells you one part of the situation. And so when we examine equity qualitatively, when we talk with people and we ask them about their experiences and we ask them to, tell us, what is your relationship with other educators here? What are some ways the institution is serving you well? What are some ways in which the institution is not serving you well? Do you feel comfortable here? Do you feel like you belong here? Do you see positive representations of yourself in the curriculum that you're studying, right? And there are certain groups, those same groups that we started with, often articulate a very different experience than their white counterparts, right? Or their more privileged counterparts. That's where we see it play out, in education, in higher education in particular. When we talk about racial equity, it's a lot of the same thing I just articulated. But I also want to highlight that while our focus so far has been on the student experience, we can also look at the experiences that different educators have. Educators who are from racially minoritized backgrounds, right? Faculty, classified professionals, executives in some places who are having a very different experience, right? Who are experiencing racial battle fatigue, or who experience racial microaggressions, who have their experience and their credentials questioned and challenged because of their racial identities, right? Because they are representing an identity that hasn't been well represented within a particular context or institution, right? So that's another example of where we see not only inequity, but racial inequity. And then when we talk with our Black colleagues and how what they experience, even when it comes to racial equity, how what they experience is very different and even more intensified, right? So here's what we have to understand. Most institutions, right, particularly in California, where you and I have the pleasure of living and working, most of our institutions are minority serving institutions, right? In terms of, what the student population looks like. We don't see the same representation amongst faculty, amongst staff, and certainly at the executive ranks. And even when we see colleges that have taken some proactive steps to address that, even when folks are hired in position, they still experience a lot of challenges that our students experiences around belonging, around battle fatigue, right? All these same things. It really highlights the multi-layered and the ways in which we're talking about equity and how we're addressing it. It's a very complex phenomenon, and it manifests and plays out in very different ways. In some way, actually, some patterns are relatively consistent across different contexts, and some issues, even if those issues are the same, they look and feel different at one place in comparison to another place. And so that's the way that I what I've experienced in working with colleges and talking with colleagues and trying to really address these issues and concerns around equity.
I'm glad you touched on not only the students, but the college personnel, even the executives. I do a lot of coaching work with a lot of presidents, and it's been very interesting to me to see how a female president of color, how she's treated compared to other folks with different ethnicities. And I would say it's a gender thing too. So, for example, there are some very strong executives who are of color who extremely strong about things, and they're going to fight, right, and encourage others to fight. But they also have kind of a support group to help them out, so that in this fight, if the reality is, presidents get fired, and it's not like they can quickly just go find another president job. And sometimes what we don't see about our female presidents is they could be single moms. They could the only ones in the executive cabinet who really truly care about racial equity, and they're constantly getting beat up, but they keep on trucking, right? But they have to play this chess game, this long-term chess game, and be very careful about what they say. And then I've also seen kind of the treatment. You don't look like a college president. I mean, these kinds of things are very interesting. And so that's one something that I have observed, Frank. What I'm really interested in now from a student perspective, you said you've spoken to students, the qualitative. What were some, maybe one or two examples of what they experienced specifically makes it an environment where they don't really feel a sense of belonging or community?
Great question, Alan. I echo a lot of what you just shared with regard to the experiences of women of color who are in executive positions. So when you're talking about, vice presidents and presidents and chancellors, they have it especially difficult. And I don't want to make this a, who has it worse type of, I don't want the conversation to necessarily be about that. But I have found and observed that Black women especially have it really, really difficult in those roles. I have found that for the most part, they're allowed to be, publicly demeaned and humiliated and stereotyped. They're called aggressive. I mean, it's a lot of the same old stereotypes of Black women that have been around for a long time. Their competence is challenged. All this stuff, and I think the fact of the matter is, a lot of people have a very difficult time taking direction and following the lead of a Black woman because, in part, most people haven't had to, right? So first and foremost, in addition to many of the long-standing stereotypes and things that have been around about Black women for a long time. And so I do agree with you. It does underscore the intersection of race and gender, right? And so, you talk about a marginalized racial identity and a marginalized gender identity that makes it especially difficult, for Black women who take on these roles and who give these institutions a lot and don't usually get what they give in return, right? Talk about loving the institution and giving the institution your all, but not really being loved back, right? And not being given the same thing. And so, I hear you on that. In terms of what students often say, I'll try to paraphrase some of the things. Folks assume that, because of, my identity, that I'm not as smart as other students. I'm not as capable of other students. People fear me because I'm a tall black man. People assume that I'm not smart because, I speak with an accent, right? Or English may not be my first language. I go and I ask for support, right? I've been out of school for a long time. I want to be here, but I find it really, really challenging to get the type of support that I need when I need it. I go to financial aid and people treat me poorly. I'm leaving class at night and walk into my car and I'm profiled by campus police because I fit the description. So in many ways, a lot of what we see and what students experience is reflective of what they experience outside of the context of education. What happens within our institutions are often a microcosm of what's happening, what's going on in society. To that point, I have also noticed, in most recent years, people are a lot more transparent and direct with regard to saying racist things, questioning, why is this person here, right? Were they born in this country? Do they belong here, right? A lot of the the anti-Asian, the racial violence that has been directed to our Asian American, friends and colleagues. Students have experienced a lot of those same things. A lot of anti-Semitic Zoom bombing. So a lot of the things that we're seeing in society, from our nation's leaders in many respects, those same things are happening within our campuses and in our institutional context, both outside of the classroom and within the classroom. And it's having an effect on students' mental health and well-being, and even their decisions to decide to enroll or not enroll. Like why, the students are saying, well, why would I put myself in this situation? Why would I give up time with my family? Why would I give up time at work to come and deal with this nonsense? Right? That's what students are articulating as being especially challenging right now.
And you're right. I think that's reflected in the data, because what I've seen nationally is that actually student course success rates are actually not horrible. They are on average 70. Some campuses, they really tout, oh, we have over 80% success rate, course success rate. And I said, you're masking something here, though. What are your completion rates? Meaning for community colleges, transfer within 3 years, or you can do a 6-year, or completing a program to earn a living wage. And that's when the numbers are really sobering. We're looking sometimes single digits. If the success rates are relatively high, but then they're not completing, it talks a lot about their experience, which you highlighted. So when the pandemic hit, Frank, I was a madman trying to create so many resources and just sending them out. And then I was also looking at, well, who's got something out there? And then you and Luke did this beautiful webinar, and you provided educators with a framework to employ equity-minded and culturally affirming teaching and learning practices in virtual communities. And you talked about being intrusive, relational, be culturally relevant and affirming, be community-focused, be race conscious. Since you've been doing a lot of work around anti-Blackness, is there a framework you can share or steps?
Yeah, great question, Al. So Luke and I were with you, when it became apparent that this wasn't going away after about 14 days, and that campus operations were going to be radically and rapidly shifting to a remote learning, model. We knew, and I'm sure you share this, we knew that a lot of educators, even if they were very effective, they didn't necessarily have the tools and resources to make that transition and to make that pivot. And so we felt like we had a responsibility as researchers and as educators ourselves to provide some guidance, to provide some direction, to provide tools. Those five principles that you just so neatly and nicely laid out, I feel like those were transferable regardless of what it is that you do on a campus. Whether you were a faculty member, whether you were counseling faculty, you were a classified professional working in financial aid or enrollment, or in the student health center, that if you keep those 5 things in mind, that you were going to be effective in being able to really support students through this difficult time. I would say a lot of the feedback that we got at that time suggested that we were heading in the right direction with regard to those 5 principles. That they really do work. They really do serve us well. We did that webinar. I want to say that was around March or April, and then we know what happened in May. Right at the end of May was the tragic murder of George Floyd, which I should say came on the heels of Ahmaud Arbery, the video being released about Ahmaud Arbery, when he was murdered. Not too long after we learned about Breonna Taylor's death as well, and so we had these 3 very prominent and in many ways representative cases of Black people being killed by, law enforcement, or, in Ahmaud's case, former, retired law enforcement, but folks who felt like they were in operating in some law enforcement capacity. And we immediately saw how that impacted the entire country. Folks were emotional. Folks were angry. The Black community felt especially vulnerable at this time. And then we had colleagues who didn't identify as Black that were also hurting from it and felt the pain of it. It felt like we got to do something. At that time, Luke and I got with 2 other colleagues, Lasana Hotep and Dr. Regina Steinbach Stroud, who was former president and former chancellor in the California Community College system. And we said, okay, let's really talk about anti-Blackness. Let's talk about kind of the historical roots of it, but really put it in the context and talk about the things that institutions needed to do. And so we came up with a 10-point plan that gave institutions some guidance on how they can respond to and how they can address anti-Blackness within their institutions. And I'm not going to go through all 10 of them, but some of the ones that were immediately relevant were, first and foremost, revisiting the history and legacy of racism at your institution. There are a lot of folks who work at institutions, don't understand the history of it, and don't understand, how Black and Indigenous people of color were denied access to those institutions. At its origins, were denied opportunities to work at those institutions, how students' experiences were still being impacted. In some cases, you had buildings and you had endowed professorships, and you had, the identities and the legacy of racism was rooted in a lot of the history and traditions that were still being celebrated at institutions. And so, we thought that was important to do. We suggested and advised institutions, don't release these statements of solidarity without also talking about some concrete support that you're going to do and offer the community, right? Whether that was mental health support, whether it was, revisiting curriculum, whatever it is, you had to have some concrete actions. Because, for a long time, colleges have always, been very good at when something happens, the response is, okay, let's quickly put out a statement that says, we stand in solidarity with our Black community, or we stand in solidarity with our, Indigenous community, or we stand in solidarity with a community who's been targeted. And then after a while, the statement gets archived in the email, and there's nothing concrete that comes out of it. And no one ever thinks about it or talks about it until the next thing happens. And so we really advise institutions to not just do that. Offer concrete support. Talk about what you're going to do, not just to respond to this issue, but also to really fundamentally change the culture and the climate of the institution. We talked about looking at student conduct data, for example, and disaggregating that data by race, ethnicity, and seeing, do you have certain groups of students that are disproportionately represented among those who are referred for student conduct campus violations? And if so, what are the sources of those referrals, right? And can we look at are there some common threads or some common elements? A lot of campuses don't even collect the data, so they would have no idea. And if they do collect it, they don't collect it in a way that would allow it to be disaggregated by race and ethnicity. So we thought that was an important practice. We talked about examining student services, because we find, when it comes to Black students, three consistent patterns. So Black students often tell us they feel unwelcomed, they feel under challenged. And so we talked about examining your student services practices, and making sure that the way that they're delivered and the way that folks in those areas communicate with Black students reflects that they are welcome and that you are there to both challenge and support them. And so we just talked about these very concrete things that institutions can do in order to really try to get at the root of anti-Blackness. Now, the fact of the matter is, here we are about 14 months since the murder of George Floyd, and there's been some accountability in the justice system in terms of, the police officers who were involved. One was convicted, as you know, and then, there are a few others that are going to be standing trial next month. But, have institutions made significant progress? My sense is no, right? Not really. A lot of institutions still have a lot of work to do to really demonstrate their commitment to the statements that they released immediately after George was murdered.
And I know it hasn't been a very long time, years, since these 10 points were developed. Do you happen to have any stories of any campuses, any college leaders that were able to take any of those and actually implement something? Do you have any success stories, or is it pretty sobering and we don't really have anything yet?
Yeah, there's certainly some success stories here and there. I'm not going to name institutions, but I know of an institution that decided that every student who's in their criminal justice program, that they're going to have to take a course on implicit bias and racism in policing, right? I mean, that's a substantive change, right? Because these are folks that are going to, eventually graduate, and if they stay in the field in which they're studying, they're going to go into the justice sector. Maybe they're going to be attorneys. Maybe some of them are going to be probation or parole officers. Maybe some are going to be correctional officers. And so providing some early exposure to some of these concepts and helping them kind of understand how they come up and how they impact how justice is actually delivered. I think that's a positive thing. You probably know this, Al. I'm sure you work with a lot of institutions. We saw a rash of hiring. I think we saw institutions that were much more intentional about who they hired, thinking about, okay, do we have Black representation in some of these key areas? We've seen institutions that have done cluster hires where they're saying, okay, we're not going to just hire one faculty member in one area. We're going to think about, can we bring in a critical mass of faculty who do work and who are committed to Black student success, Black liberation, and we're going to bring them out, right? There's some pockets of, I would call them bright spots here and there, but, I wouldn't say that, maybe it's probably more of a reflection of, what I expected, my expectations. And so I expected institutions and systems to do more. That's what my perspective is on that.
My work, my outcomes, what I'm always looking at when I'm working with institutions is I'm always looking at the prize, which is equity. And it's, as an implementer, it's very important to think about the means. And that's why I'm big on kindness. I find it's very effective, especially when you have your red lighters when it comes to equity, racial equity, and especially anti-Blackness. And then you have your yellow lighters. And I try my best to bring those yellow lighters to green. One thing that I found helpful, and I stole this from one of the campuses that I coach, actually down in your area, and I'll give her credit because she's the one who told me this, Dr. Lisa Brewster. She described how, when we enter a building and the door automatically opens for you, or if you're carrying something heavy and there's an option of stairs, which could be challenging for some people, or there's a ramp, so you can take the ramp. So basically, we have all benefited because we decided to take care of our disabled brothers and sisters. And I tried to give a similar message that for our yellow lighters and even red light, when we take care of Black students, and sometimes I have to use the group that everybody seems to care about. I'm one of them, veterans. That if you take care of veterans, everybody will benefit. They kind of get that. If I say veterans' lives matter, they don't say, "Oh no, all lives matter." Right? It's very interesting dynamic there. But at any rate, I find that sometimes that's helpful. Also helping them just through the work. Let's be part of a team. We're going to go through an inquiry and action process to improve our craft. And in that process, we're going to happen to disaggregate data and see what it tells us. Do you have other approaches, Frank, that you wouldn't mind sharing to help more of those yellow lighters and even the red lighters to move more into the green that you wouldn't mind sharing?
I would say what I do and how I approach it, Al, is in many ways aligned with the approach that you just articulated. And so I agree, you can't start with the red lighters, and you can't design whatever it is you're doing, professional development, whether you're coming up with new institutional policies or practices, you can't have the red lighters in mind when you do that, right? Because if you do, then you never come up with something that can be as meaningful and as impactful as if you focus on the yellow lighters, right? The folks that have, in some ways, the shortest distance to go when it comes to knowledge and understanding and embracing equity mindedness, right? The yellow lighters are much closer to the green than the red lighters are. So I don't typically start with the red lighters. The theory behind the way I approach it is if I can get enough critical mass, if I can get enough of those yellow lighters to become green lighters, and we get critical mass there, then they can create an institutional context where it's uncomfortable and unpopular to be a yellow lighter, right? To be a red lighter. And so that's the theory behind it. I believe, and I think you agree with me here. I also believe in you have to meet folks where they are, and we have some colleagues who would disagree with this approach. And so it may mean that you have to start with a population like this. Maybe you're working with a campus, and they have huge issues around racial equity, but they have some commitment and some connection to, say, students with disabilities or former foster youth. Well, sometimes you got to kind of start there. From there, you try to move them more to a focus on racial equity. Now, I will say this. There are some colleagues that would criticize me, especially, right, as, someone who's a part of a racially minoritized community, to say, hey, why are you taking an approach? Why are you're trying to make folks more comfortable? The problem is folks are too comfortable. So you need to go right in and you need to address where they're uncomfortable. And, I think maybe there's some merit in that. It's just not the way that I've approached it. And I haven't necessarily been successful in that. But I've been thinking about that a lot more. Like, is my approach making it too comfortable? Should I be challenging folks and pushing folks a little bit more at the outset, and recognize that when that happens, you're going to turn some folks off and you're going to lose some folks, but you're also going to get some folks who are like, wow, right? It's going to be much more impactful. And so there's that. Every place is different. Where we've had a lot of success, to be honest with you, is when we can connect equity and racial equity to other things that the institution values. So, right, you're going to agree with me on this. The concept of equity planning in California's community colleges, as an example, has been around since the early 90s. However, it wasn't a funded initiative, and I know it's much more than an initiative. So to our equity champions who are listening, I know equity is more than just an initiative, but bear with me. But it wasn't something that was funded until 2014. And once you start to attach funding to something like equity, then it becomes more of an institutional priority, right? Because with funding, you got resources, you can create cultural centers, you can hire, build your workforce, right? There's all these things you can do that you can't do in the absence of funding. Then we can kind of talk about, okay, to your point, well, if we're going to be looking at equity, we can't look at equity without disaggregating our data, right? There's no way you can do that. And so I know your focus right now is on, say, students with disabilities, But we also need to disaggregate this data by race and ethnicity and see, are there some disparities? Are there some things that we don't know about? Are there some things that we're seeing? Or even if we do know racially minoritized students are disproportionately impacted, we may not know the intensity of the disproportionate impact. We may not know where it is. We may not know, right? And so you use that. And because there's an equity plan and because there's some funding and some accountability that's attached to it, folks are much more open. Even folks who may have been, initially resistant are much more open to it. And then, the last thing I'll say is where I think we have a longer way to go, but where I think is important is we got to start holding folks accountable for closing equity gap. You can be a president, you can be a college president, whether it's a community college or a university president. Historically, you could have horrible success rates for racially minoritized students or any population and not necessarily be held accountable for that as an institutional leader. And so we got to make sure closing equity gaps and things like that's a part of how folks are evaluated. It's in folks' job descriptions. It's in, that it becomes a criterion for evaluating performance, right? And I think when we can start to do that, right, when we can have this become a part of how we view institutional effectiveness, like no one would ever be able to continue to be, in a role if they weren't doing a good job of balancing their budgets, or if they were having, all these lawsuits or things like that, right? And so I think equity and student success has to be taken as seriously as some of those things as well.
Yeah, a few things, Frank. I get the same thing from my colleagues about my approach. Like they even use the word, they use it. They say, you got to be more militant. You got to go in there and tell them how it is. And I said, well, I have an outcome I want to achieve. That doesn't work. And it's not my style. It's not my style. And I've seen actually the impact of that. And it actually turns yellow lighters into red lighters. So I get where they're coming from, and it comes from a place of hurt. And they really they feel strongly that no apologies, this is the way it is. But again, I go to, it's a means to an end. And there's a timing, there is a point where you can be more aggressive about it throughout, the process of taking a campus through this change. It's just sometimes it isn't a good idea to that first meeting. And, Frank, what's so difficult about campuses when they're trying to implement any priority. So I'll give you one example. I'll give you two. One is the typical campus, people fail to realize they only have 2 or 3 months in a year to actually get some priority work done. Because faculty have to be involved, right? They're key to this. And so they're often gone in the summer. So you miss that. September, what do you hear, Frank? It's too busy. Start of the semester. October is okay. November, December, are you crazy? That's the holidays. We're lucky to squeeze in maybe a meeting or two. January, gone again. February, no, because we're just starting the semester. March is all right, depending on the campus. April, no, we got spring break. And in May, no way, right? So we often forget. Now, what I tell campuses, especially campus leaders, I say, well, don't be the typical campus. Find ways to keep that momentum going. The second piece that I find really interesting, I find this dynamic happening all the time, is let's say, Frank, you and I go to a meeting, some committee meeting, and someone, let's say a faculty member says something and just throws the wrench into momentum around equity. And then the meeting is done and people leave going, well, faculty don't agree with this. And it was one person. But everybody uses the word faculty as if that one person represents everybody. And the same thing happens with administrators. And that's how I find some of these anti-equity, anti-racist people, they're actually really shrewd. They know how to use the committee structure. They know how to use participatory governance. They know it only takes 2 or 3 months in a year to actually get priority work. And so they use that to their advantage. And so in terms of accountability, I often go back and forth with that one, Frank, because let's say back to that female president I was talking about, right? She's fighting hard. But she has to be careful how to fight. Otherwise, she might have a board that's, let's just say, are not very equity minded. That's another issue altogether, right? Years go by and they don't move the needle, but then should we hold her accountable? So that accountability piece, I don't know, Frank. So anyway, those are my thoughts. I don't know if you had any comments on my reaction.
Yeah, I mean, just really spot on points. And so accountability can mean a lot of different things. To me, in this context, accountability could be, we should have, we have board meetings every month, right? We're talking about community colleges in California in particular. You have board meetings every month. And so I think it's important for the board to be asking, hey, where are we with regard to student equity? Where are we with regard to meeting the goals of our equity plan? Tell us what is going on. What institutional actions are happening? What new committees are being formed? What work is being done? What successes have we had, right? So it's not always about, hey, if you don't meet these very, arbitrary goals, you're out of here. But it's asking the question, it's being engaged. It's having it be a part of, okay, did you balance your budget? Did you do this? Did you do that? Right? Okay. It's requiring folks to speak on it and to report on it. Right? It's one, and that's something that doesn't happen at, a lot of places. I would even say it doesn't happen at most places. And so even if, to the example that you shared to that president who may be struggling to get buy-in, right? You still have to navigate that, right? So you can't go into the board meeting and say, hey, well, we're making no progress, because, I got a faculty executive committee in the Senate that's holding things up, right? So it's not, you can't say that, but, I think it would be important to let the board know, hey, this is what we need to move things forward. Sometimes accountability is about changing policies, changing institutional policies, and changing institutional structures that make it difficult to do the work. So you talk about the faculty contract. Faculty have to be engaged in this work, right? At some point, you can only go so far without that. And so are there some things that we can do with regard to faculty contracts and faculty assignments that facilitate faculty engagement in this rather than disincentivize it? Yeah, so when I say accountability, in some ways it could be like, hey, you know what, we've been at this for 3, 4, 5 years, and it could be asking the tough questions, but it could also be staying engaged in what is going on, as a leader, if you're an executive, if you're a vice president, when you're having your one-on-ones with your deans, having on the agenda, hey, okay, talk to me about equity. What's going on? What are we doing, right? If you're the president or a chancellor, asking the folks who report to you the same thing. And so I think that's where, I find that sometimes, maybe less so more recently, but certainly in past times, it only came up when the equity plan was due. There was it wasn't a part of the day-to-day conversations that folks are having, either formal conversations or informal conversations. And I think it has to be more ingrained in the institutional culture for us to really be able to move things in a way that we need to move them.
Yes, Frank. And I think there should be accountability for board members. Unfortunately, their accountability comes with elections and not enough people vote. And so I'll be candid. You get some of a particular political persuasion and they actually block the equity work. They're the kinds of people where you say Black Lives Matter and they respond with no, all lives matter. They're often the ones who block actually this work. But we don't have really an accountability pressure point for them other than, their election. I want to get back to the closing equity gaps, because this is another thing that I told my colleagues is that closing equity gaps is not enough. Because if we have, let's say, a 17% completion rate, and that's the highest group, the highest performing, let's say Black students are 10 points below that, and then everybody's brought up to 17. That's horrible. I mean, we should celebrate that we close them, but I think a lot of people forget that we still have so much work to do. That closing equity gaps, absolutely. But the work of change, culture change to bring these numbers up significantly more, it's just hard work. It's really, really difficult work. As you know, there's this guided pathways framework that colleges have been trying to implement. I've been helping them. How do you apply an equity lens to that? And the same thing I mentioned earlier about the 2 or 3 months in a year, how people use committees to block. I see it all, Frank, about that. We're going to go into fifth year in California guided pathways, and there's probably a handful that actually are doing something, implementing, whereas others are kind of stuck in that planning mode. Since there are 10 points, Frank, would you mind sharing maybe one or two more from that 10 point?
Absolutely, happy to do it. But can I comment on what you just talked about?
Absolutely.
I agree. Board members should be held more accountable, for equity and for student success. I agree. It does go back to who's elected to the boards, and this is a challenge with K-12 too.
Yes.
It's not just a higher ed or a post-secondary ed challenge. Is the folks who are most likely to be elected, by and large, are not really educators, or not even folks who really care all that much about education, right? At least about public education. And so you have folks who are being elected that don't really understand educational policy, that don't understand curriculum, that don't understand like some pretty fundamental things about what makes an institution go and what does an institution need. And so when that person, or when you have a critical mass of people on a board that's not committed or not engaged, well then, we get a lot of what we've gotten, either folks who are blocking important institutional actions for political reasons because they want to, they want to make sure that when they run for city council or when they run for mayor or whatever the next step is, that they don't lose votes in that regard, right? And while they're doing that, they're harming students, they're harming families, and they're harming communities. And that's not hyperbole. They are actually doing things to hurt the people who need the support the most, right? And that's disgraceful that they would do that. So I think part of what we have to do, and I don't know, maybe we need to be more intentional in talking with our colleges about, making sure that you are in communication with your community, with the folks who are making decisions about who gets to serve on the board. Give them some guidance around what does the college need, and what is a good candidate to serve on the board, right? What are certain past experiences or certain competencies? What are some things you should expect? Because right now it's kind of, I don't know how it happens. It's whoever. I mean, I really don't know, right? It's kind of all over the place. But you get a lot of folks who are serving on these boards who don't know or don't care enough about education. So that's important.
And Frank, really quickly, look at the CRT conversation that's happening nationally. School boards are banning something it's not even taught.
Not even taught in K-12 schools. I would imagine that most folks who are on this ban critical race theory have never ever read a book or an article. Like, they have no idea what critical race theory is. Right. It's just a political. They say, hey, you know what? The folks at CPAC said that we should do this, and that'll help us get more votes. So let's just do it. And they have no idea what they're calling for. They have no idea what they're banning. But it makes for great political rhetoric, and it does a good job of riling up folks who are anti-race, anti-immigrant, anti-progressive, in my opinion. So it works really well. It does. It's doing exactly what it's supposed to do, I suppose. That's probably the most prominent example, but there are other examples that hit even a little bit closer to home with regard to what our community college colleagues are facing and dealing with and trying to move things forward, for sure. You also asked about some of the other points, but some other things that we talked about is making sure that becoming an anti-racist institution is not just something that you say, but something that you're committed to doing. And so what that means is that you have to look at what are the institutional policies and practice. You almost need to do like a real audit and figure out what are the institutional policies and practices. Policies, as you know, are things that are codified, that have been sanctioned, either, by a governing body or, a stakeholder group through votes and so forth. And policies are things that are not necessarily written, but practices that happen that are a part of the institutional culture. What are all the things that we're doing that's allowing, anti-Blackness to exist and persist? So then you got to look at your curriculum. You have to look at your HR policies. You have to look at grievance policies. You have to be willing to engage in a deep and critical examination of everything that makes your college a college. And you ask one question: does this policy advance anti-Blackness or does it disrupt it? And there's no middle ground, right? Either is or it isn't. Ibram Kendi says there's no neutral policies, right? There are no race neutral policies. They're either racist or they're not racist. And that's how we have to look at it and examine it. Another one that comes to mind also is making sure that you make addressing anti-racism or anti-Blackness a strategic priority. So if this is a real institutional priority, it needs to be articulated in your strategic plan. And if it's in your strategic plan, you need to have measurable goals that help to document progress. And you need to have resources that are allocated towards doing it. So that might mean you need to, invest some money towards an employee resource group for your Black employees. Or you need to create a Black cultural center, and that's going to require some investment, right? So these are, and there's more for sure, but those are, again, a couple other ones that I would add to the list for sure.
I'm glad I asked. I really appreciate you mentioning those other two. We ask our students as we educate them, hey, we want you to think critically. We want you to have grit. We want you to blah, blah, blah. But then sometimes we don't model that.
Right.
So we need to model that. We need to think critically about our practices, our policies, our procedures, the way we teach, the way we serve students, the kind of experience that we give them, and look at ourselves in the mirror and then work toward action. Because I see too many data talks, data this, data that, and then just no action. Just another tactic to look at data, question it, and this is where they get bogged down in no action. As we wrap up, I want to go back to the boxing because I think that the work that people at colleges do to really do the things that you were mentioning is like training for a boxing match or actually being in a boxing match. People they've seen it as a violent sport. It is, but it's also it's an art. The way to be tremendously physically fit, but just mentally fit, and to have a strategy, to be smart, to know about timing, balance. These are the kinds of things that all of our equity colleagues need to just continue to fight, right? So we'll encourage everybody to take some boxing, right, Frank?
Yeah, I definitely take boxing if either for the reasons that I'm doing it, or for any other reasons. I really like the metaphor. Al, because with boxing, you have to do two things to be a good boxer. So you have to be able to be assertive and be offensive, right? In sort of your approach. But you also have to, while you're doing that, you also have to, have good defense. You have to be reactive. So you have to kind of be able to do both simultaneously. You got to kind of see a punch coming before it hits you. You got to counter punch. I mean, there's all these things, all these elements, both physical and mental elements that all have to come together. And, I feel like in a lot of ways, that's what we're asking our educators to do with regard to, closing equity and achievement gaps. There's some things that we have to do to be proactive in how we do it, right? We got to be on the offense. Boxing, if you don't like the boxing metaphor, I think dancing works the same way, is being in sync with your partner. We have to think about how do we get all the key stakeholders in sync? How do we get everybody dancing together, right? If we're going back to boxing, how do we make sure all of everything that we're doing, that it's aligned and that it's moving together, it's moving in the right direction, and we can be good punchers, but we can also be good counter punchers and so forth. And obviously the opponent that we're fighting is inequity, is systemic racism, is systemic oppression, is all the stuff that has long plagued us as an educational community that, despite our best efforts, have really made progress difficult in closing the equity gap. Also, Al, I would say that, boxing is a sport that has been around for hundreds of years. When you're learning to box, you're kind of, for the most part, the things you're learning are not new, right? These are things that have been around for a long time. These are, tried and tested strategies. But every now and then you get a boxer, you get a Muhammad Ali, or you get somebody that revolutionizes the sport in a real meaningful way. And what that person does is just kind of comes in and takes something that has already been established and takes it to the next level. And so I feel like that's a lot of what we have to do, is really think of ourselves as coming in, like we all come in with training, we all come in with degrees and graduate degrees, and we've all been taught how to be educators. But what we really have to do is take what we've learned and figure out, how do we revolutionize it? How do we adapt it? How do we make it work for today's context and today's student population? Recognizing that today, what we're dealing with and who we're serving today, the conditions we're dealing with and who we're serving today are very different from, what they were and who they were decades ago. But a lot of our theories and a lot of the things that we've learned over the years in terms of what it means to be an effective educator is based on, conditions and populations that don't reflect our today's challenges. And so we really have to revolutionize what we do. We have to radically reimagine what we do. And we have to really be willing to not just come in and maintain the status quo, but we have to challenge the status quo. I think that's what it's going to take. And it's not going to just be one person, right? It has to be a collection of folks that are committed to doing it.
Well, I'm that coach in the corner trying to train, try to help people, help them have the tools to know when do I go on defense, offense, when do I need to do both simultaneously. So I can't thank you enough, Frank, because I know that's what you do. Thank you for participating in the Student Success Podcast.
Thank you, Al. This is a wonderful conversation. I appreciate you. I appreciate your leadership. I appreciate all that you do to support colleges. And I know you and I, we're both on the same team, and there's others who are also on the same team. And so, we just have to continue to stay committed to the work.
Fly like a butterfly and sting like a bee, man.
Oh, yes.
Thank you for listening to the Student Success Podcast. Each episode has show notes, which include helpful links and necessary follow-up information to help you get results. Please consider subscribing to the Continuous Learning Institute website. There are no advertisements. It's simply updates about articles, tools, resources, podcasts, etc., all tailored for you, the practitioner. Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Student Success Podcast. Each episode has show notes, which include helpful links and necessary follow-up information to help you get results. Please consider subscribing to the Continuous Learning Institute website. There are no advertisements. It's simply updates about articles, tools, resources, podcasts, etc., all tailored for you, the practitioner. Thank you.